When I asked you kind of to think about what your screen epiphany might be, you were kind of almost immediately, you came back with either Seventh Voyage of Sinbad or 2001: A Space Odyssey. And obviously both different films in a sense, but what was it about 2001 that really kind of made that impact?
Well, it depends how you define epiphany. But I've had a lot of extraordinary experiences in the cinema, and Seventh Voyage of Sinbad was the movie that, made me want to be a filmmaker. But I was 8 years old. But this movie I saw under extraordinary circumstances. And can I read this thing?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, read that. That's fine. Something I prepared earlier.
Yeah, I thought I'd just stand up and read this. I didn't know I had to. Okay. I first saw this film, 2001: A Space Odyssey, in the best possible way to see a movie, with no preconceptions or expectations, in a perfect cinema. At the time, I was 17 and working as a mailboy at 20th Century Fox Studios in West LA. I had been in school with both Eloise and Andy Blau, brother and sister and daughter of attorney Louis Blau. Mr. Blau was Stanley Kubrick's lawyer. Anyway, they invited me to a midnight screening on a weeknight at the Pacific Warner Cinerama Theater on Hollywood Boulevard, which has been closed many years. Mr. Blau would be seeing his client's new movie. So there were 5 or 6 of us teenagers sitting in the first row of the balcony and several adults seated below in an empty house at midnight. None of us knew anything about what we were going to see, although I knew it was Kubrick's newest movie and that it was science fiction. I was already a Kubrick fan. In the language of the time, we had our minds blown. Imagine seeing this knowing nothing. It was extraordinary. Although Pauline Kael said in her New Yorker review of 2001: A Space Odyssey, it was a monumentally unimaginative movie. I thought it was, and I still believe it to be, astonishing. All of the effects were done in camera. This is long before digital compositing and computer-generated imagery. Seldom has a Strauss waltz been so magnificent. The pace may seem slow to a contemporary audience, and much of the future shown, the future as predicted from 1968 to 2001, has been proven false. The Soviet Union has gone the way of Pan Am. But the cultural impact and influence of this picture is undeniable. For those of you who are seeing this for the first time, prepare to have your minds blown. I didn't realize I had to say anything else.
No, I mean, that kind of says it all in a sense, isn't it?
There's a hell of a lot to say about this movie, but the first question I have is there anyone here that this is the first time they're seeing it?
Wow.
That's exciting. Okay, that's exciting. That's who I wish I was right now. And I wish the screen was even bigger. I saw it in Cinerama. I mean, this is an extraordinary movie. It was extremely, I want to say revolutionary, really. It's basically a silent film, as you'll discover. Alex North. It's funny, the school I went to with Andy and Eloise Blau was called Oakwood. It was a hippie school I was thrown out of. But it was amazing because there were only 50 students. I was only there a year, but there were 50 students. And among those 50 students, from the 7th to the 9th grade, were the children of Elmer Bernstein, Alex North, Jerry Goldsmith, and Ernest Gold. So I used to go to a lot of scoring sessions. It was very cool. Alex North actually wrote a score for this picture, which was recorded. And after a preview, Kubrick dumped it and famously went to Sam Goody's on 42nd Street and went to the Deutsche, what's it called? Deutsche Grammophon cassette section and bought out all the Strauss, all the Beethoven, all the Mozart. And it's amazing. He literally bought like 400 cassettes and went and listened to them. And then they cut some sequences to these cassettes. And it's quite extraordinary. This was all, believe it or not, this is what's called needle drop. Do you know what that is? Needle drop is when you use an already recorded piece of music, like a rock song, like what I did in American Werewolf. or what Marty Scorsese does brilliantly. It's a needle drop. And what a lot of people do shitty. But this is a needle drop picture, which is kind of astonishing because the music is so brilliantly used and so correct. And it's kind of impossible to separate some of this music from the imagery. I had a Mr. Smith, actually. Ham Smith was a teacher at Oakwood. And one day, Andy Gold sang stupid thing. He sings, Toreadora, don't spit on the floor, use the cuspidora, what do you think it's for, right? And Mr. Smith was furious. He said, you've ruined Carmen for me. He was a man of colossally unimaginative guy. But in an interesting way, he had a valid point, because you can't hear Thus Sprach Zarathustra or the Blue Danube once you see this picture. It's separated from the imagery.
But it's been an influence, clearly, throughout your...
This movie? Oh, my God, yeah. Not just me. The entire body of work of Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, and Ridley Scott, and many others. I think only Forbidden Planet, probably, or Metropolis, are as influential as this picture.
And did you ever have any encounters with Kubrick yourself?
Yeah. He was an interesting and fascinating guy. I mean, brilliant. A real New Yorker. It's funny because everyone thinks he's English. Man, was this guy. Should have heard his accent. But I was at Twickenham Studios here in 1981 in pre-production on An American Werewolf in London. At Twickenham were the offices of Sir Richard Attenborough, John Schlesinger, and Dick Lester. All had offices there. And at that moment, what's his name? Warren Beatty was shooting Reds there. It's always neat. And one day, Dickie Attenborough, that's what he was called, I swear to God. I mean, I was call me Dickie. I'm thinking, really? Okay. Anyway, Dickie Attenborough stuck his head in my office and said, we're going over to, I think it was Shepperton, I've forgotten, but we're going over to look at this new piece of equipment called a Steadicam because Stanley's testing it. Do you want to see it? Stanley Kubrick? Or Donen, which one? You know, I was like, I'll take either one. And he said, yeah, Stanley Kubrick. It's a new thing called a Steadicam. Gareth Brown invented it, camera operator. And there had been one movie that had used it called Bound for Glory. Wonderful Hal Ashby movie. You ever seen that? It's wonderful. There was a shot in it that when I saw the movie, I went, how the did they? I mean, it's an extraordinary, with Woody Guthrie's walking, David Carradine's walking in a crowded place, and he's walking. It's a long, long, long. But then there's a moving train that enters the shot from a distance and goes, and then he starts running. And I go, wait a minute. This isn't a track. How are we doing? Are we on a car? How are we doing this? And then he jumps onto the moving train, onto the ladder, climbs up the ladder. We go with him to the top of the freight car, sits down, and there's like a 4-minute scene. I thought, how the hell did it? Well, Steadicam, first time. Anyway, so I was very excited. He obviously was taken with the piece of equipment because several years later he made The Shining with it. But there was only one in the world at that time. Gareth was bringing, and you had to hire him. And what Kubrick wanted to do was have him make several and train some British operators. So the British, I'm embarrassed, I've forgotten his name. But the guy who actually did The Shining was there, the operator. And I really feel bad I forgot his name. Wonderful British operator. Anyway, I saw it and immediately said, when are you going back to the States? He said, tomorrow. I said, will you rent this to me? And so American Werewolf is actually the third movie to ever use it. And my director of photography was Robert Painter, great British DP, Bob Painter, who shot 9 of my movies. And we were at Technicolor London in Soho watching dailies of the, in the tubes where we shot that thing, the wolf's POV. And he looked at, I'll never forget, Bob looked at me and he went, gee, there's an instant cliche. It was true. Anyway, so I met Stanley then. I have a very weird story about Stanley Kubrick. It's just such a dumb story, but I'm such a fanboy, So I said, Mr. Kubrick, can I call me Stanley? Okay, Mr. Kubrick. Can I would you sign something for me? He said, yeah, send it to my office. Great. So I wrote home to my mother. I said, go in my old room, and there's, and I had a lobby card from Dr. Strangelove of the War Room, the famous shot. Anyway, I said, so she sent it to me. So it was like 3 weeks later, I mailed it to Stanley Kubrick. I never got it back. And after a couple of weeks, I called, did Mr. Kubrick get my, oh, yes. Is he going to sign it and, send it back to me? He's like, I'll ask him, The bottom line is Stanley Kubrick stole my lobby card. It's a true story. He stole my lobby card. So I said, may I speak to Mr. Kubrick? It's like he stole my lobby card. And so what happened was I was at, the Boyle family, the wonderful artist? Well, I was at their house, and the phone rings, and Joan goes, do you know someone named Stanley Kubrick? And I really did say, how did you get this number? I have no idea. Anyway, he said, look, I know you're upset with me because I didn't, but I'm going to have it copied. I just never saw it before. It's too late to send it back to you. I'm framing it. I was like, what the f***? I want my lobby card. Anyway, I spoke to him about 8 times over the phone over the years. He had these I learned later, Albert Brooks, I found out, he would call Albert Brooks at strange hours of the morning in London and have phone conversations for hours. And my conversations with Mr. Kubrick were always very odd. I only talked to him maybe 6 times on the phone. But he always wanted to talk about money. He wanted to talk about box office. He wanted to talk about explaining to me how he would own the camera equipment or the what are they called? The Winnebagos. What do you call them? Honey wagons. And you call them something else. Caravans. You call them caravans. He would own the caravans and then rent them to the studio and how he got double pay. I mean, it was like, I don't want to talk about money.
Those are not the conversations you want to be having with Stanley Kubrick.
No.
Amazing though it might be to have him on the other end of the phone.
No, it was actually very frustrating for me because I'm like talking to,
but did you not ask
in my opinion.
Were not points in the conversation where you actually found yourself coming up with those questions that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, he basically deflected any question about his work. I mean, I learned when in the same year I saw this movie, I saw Arthur C. Clarke speak at UCLA in Royce Hall. He went on a tour of North America, probably Great Britain too, promoting the movie. And he gave a lecture series, and he was profound, and he said a lot more about this movie than Stanley ever did. Stanley would explain how things were done and shots were done and stuff, but he never really wanted to talk about meaning or anything like that. I can't claim any relationship really with Stanley Kubrick other than I'm a fanboy. I think Dr. Strangelove is almost perfect.
And this is the film that he won the kind of the personal Oscar for as well, visual effects. I think any other Oscars he got were kind of like achievement. I think he didn't get a kind of personal Oscar.
Well, I had a conversation with Mr. Kubrick very much like Marty Scorsese, which was very odd to me, but I totally understand it. Which is, I once told Marty how much I loved King of Comedy, and Marty said, King of Comedy was a failure financially, so Marty thinks it's bad. It was, Marty, it's brilliant, Didn't he doesn't want to talk about it.
Wow.
It's like, and Mr. Kubrick was the same thing with Barry Lyndon. Because, I had his phone number. So when I saw it, I called him because I was crazy about Barry Lyndon. And he said, it's not making any money.
And that was that.
Yeah, it was pretty much the end of that conversation. But listen, the guy was extraordinary. And one of the things you learn about filmmaking, I guess about everything, but there's no right or wrong way. Because you look at filmmakers like Stanley Kubrick or especially David Lean, there are a lot of these guys who are completely profligate. They piss money away. I mean, David Lean famously would wait for the sunset or wait for the movies would triple and quadruple their budgets. I mean, they were, but look at the movies. It's very hard to say, well, I guess, it's a very difficult thing to quantify, how you make the movie.
And with time, you can quantify it in a much better way as well, can't you? Because it's either a classic in a sense or it's not. And a film like that, over time, I guess,
it's not. You know what? It's not about quantifying it. I mean, Peter Bogdanovich, when he was a critic, said that he was, by the way, a great critic. So was Paul, what's his name? You know, the other filmmaker, Paul Schrader. They were both, so was Truffaut. Great critics. Good directors and great critics. Anyway, Peter Bogdanovich said the only true test of a movie is time, which sounds obvious, but is completely true. And it's interesting how many movies that are failures or critically reviled years later considered masterpieces.